Picture a mountain in the dead of winter and a blizzard swallowing it whole. Now come down through the snow, down to a single light burning at the end of a frozen trail. A cabin, a fire, 11 hard men inside, men with scars and long beards, the kind of men a whole valley has learned to fear. And then against that door a knock, faint, failing, the knock of someone with nothing left. Because nobody climbs 6 miles up a mountain in a storm like this, not unless they're dying. The door opens, and a half-frozen boy falls through it. No coat, blue lips, and wrapped against his chest, kept warm by his own going cold, a child. A little girl 2 years old who looks up at these terrifying strangers without an ounce of fear and says 3 words none of them will ever forget. Daddy, angels came. But that child does not belong to a stranger. The snow came down like the sky had given up on the world. Not soft, not gentle, the kind of snow that meant business, the kind that buried fence posts and froze cattle standing up and turned the mountains into a wall of white that pressed close against the windows. In the high country above Quartz Hollow in the Montana Territory, the winter of 1884 had teeth, and on that particular night those teeth were out. So when the knock came faint and failing against the door of the ranch house at the end of Dry Fork Trail, it cut through 11 hard men like a blade through tallow. Because nobody knocks on a door 6 miles up a mountain in a blizzard, not unless they're dying. Reuben Hargrove was on his feet before he decided to be. He was 51 years old and built like the side of the mountain he lived on. Shoulders that filled a doorway. Arms thick as fence rails from 40 winters of trapping and hauling and surviving where lesser men froze. A beard gone gray hung to his chest, and a scar ran down the left side of his face, from the top of his ear, clean to the line of his jaw, pale against weathered skin. He wore a coat made from the hide of a buffalo he'd killed himself, and when he stood, men found reasons to be elsewhere. The folks down in this valley had a name for him and his, the Devils of Dry Fork. They weren't wrong about how the men looked. Scarred hands, long beards, faces carved by weather and grief into something the good people of the town crossed the street to avoid. But the valley didn't know the half of why they'd gathered up here away from everything. The valley didn't know what each of these men had lost before he came up the mountain. The valley only knew to be afraid. A fire popped in the stone hearth. A lamp guttered low. The dog by the door, an old gray brute named Cinder, who never made a sound he didn't mean, came up off the floor with his hackles raised, and the knock came again. And the man nearest the door pulled it open. He was lean, gray-eyed, a fellow they called Shade, who'd worn a federal marshal's badge once before the law, and his conscience came to a parting of the ways. He pulled the door open and the storm came in. The cold came in. The white came in. And so did the boy. He didn't walk in so much as fall through the doorway, and Shade caught him by the shoulders before he hit the floor. He was young, 15 maybe, soaked clean through, shaking so hard his teeth made a sound like sleet on a window. His lips were the color of a bruise. He wore no coat. None at all. Just a thin shirt gone stiff with ice, and a pair of boots 2 sizes too big with the soles flapping loose at the toe, packed full of snow. But that wasn't the thing that stopped the heart of every man in that room. The thing that stopped their hearts was what the boy was carrying. Wrapped against his chest, bundled up in a man's heavy coat, far too big for either of them, was a child. A little girl, no more than 2 years old. Her round face poked out from the collar, and her dark eyes were open. Watching, steady, not crying, not afraid. Just looking around at the room full of giants like she'd known all along they'd be there. The boy had given her his coat. That was why he had none. For however many miles he'd carried her through that killing storm, he'd kept her warm by going cold himself. Lord Almighty, somebody breathed. And then the room came alive. It moved without a word being spoken. That was the thing about these men. They'd all been to dark places, every one of them, and they knew what mattered and how fast it mattered. Somebody killed the draft from the door. Somebody pulled blankets off a backroom cot. A broad-shouldered man in his late 40s was already crossing the floor with a worn leather bag in one hand, a former army surgeon they called Sawbones, who'd stitched men back together in the field hospitals of a war that had bled the whole country, white 20 years gone, and who had never once let his skill go rusty because he'd seen too plain what came of help arriving a minute too late. Sawbones dropped to his knees beside the boy. His hands went to the boy's throat, then his wrist. "He's near froze through," Sawbones said. Low, even. Pulse is slow. He's been out in this far too long. His fingers moved to the boy's left hand, the one still curled tight around the child, even half-conscious as he was. And the surgeon went quiet a moment. 3 fingers gone white. Frostbite set in. We've got a little time before it turns. Not much. Reuben crossed the room. He didn't run. Reuben Hargrove had not run from anything in 15 years. But there was a speed to him all the same, a kind of terrible care, and when he reached down, it was for the child. She let him take her. Didn't fight, didn't cry, just lifted up out of the boy's arms like she'd been waiting on it and settled against the buffalo hide and looked up at the giant with the scarred face and the gray beard. And something in Reuben's chest, something that had been frozen solid for a very long time, gave a single hard crack. Because he knew this child. He knew the weight of her. He knew the part in her dark hair. He knew the small hand that came up now and curled into his collar like it had 1,000 times before bedtime. He knew her. Birdie, he said. His voice came out of him like something dragged up from the bottom of a well. And the little girl, his Birdie, looked up at her father's face and said the only kind of sentence a 2-year-old can say. Daddy, angels came. The room had gone graveyard quiet. 11 hard men stood frozen in the firelight, looking at their leader, holding a child. Not one of them had known was missing. Because she hadn't been missing. She'd been down in the town at the doctor's place with Reuben. He'd taken her there that very afternoon when he'd come down off the mountain feeling poorly, feeling weak in a way that scared a man who was never weak. She'd been with him, and now she was here, in the arms of a half-frozen stranger who'd appeared out of the worst storm of the winter. How, Reuben said. Just the one word. He couldn't manage more. Sawbones looked up from the boy. He can't tell you nothing right now. He's slipping. He had blankets around the boy, already working fast, lifting that frost-bitten hand and wrapping it loose and warm. Build the fire up, not too close. Slow and steady, or we do more harm than good. And somebody get this child looked at. She's not hurt, Reuben said. He'd already checked. His hands, big as they were, had gone over her gentle as a man handling a robin's egg. She's warm. She's dry. His throat worked. He kept her warm. He looked down at the boy on the floor. This stranger. This ghost of a child who'd walked into the devil's den out of the dark, half dead, and the first thing he'd done, the only thing, was keep someone else's daughter alive. Who are you? Reuben said. But the boy's eyes had rolled white and he was gone, sunk down into the warmth in the dark, and there'd be no answer tonight. So Reuben knelt. The biggest man in the territory got down on the floor beside a homeless boy, and he laid one enormous scarred hand over that ruined frostbitten one, careful as he could to lend it what warmth he had. And he waited. They worked through the night. Sawbones never left the boy's side. He warmed him by degrees the way you have to, the way that takes a patience most men don't own. He held that hand and watched the gray fingers, watched and waited and watched, and somewhere in the small black hours of the morning, he let out a breath he must have been holding for a long while. Color's coming back, he said. He'll keep the hand. Boy's lucky. Luckier than he's got any right to be. Reuben sat near with Birdie asleep against his chest, and he did not move, and he did not speak. The men came and went around him, low-voiced, banking the fire, drying out the boy's pitiful boots, hanging that great heavy coat by the hearth, the coat the boy had wrapped around the child. It was Parson who found it. Parson was a slight, soft-spoken man of 43 who'd worn a preacher's collar once and a schoolmaster's chalk dust before that, until the day he'd reported a thing being done to a child and watched the men in charge decide it was easier to look the other way. He'd never forgiven them. He'd never forgiven himself for thinking they wouldn't. So now he kept to the edges of things, and he watched the way men do who've learned the cost of not watching. He was hanging that coat by the fire when his hand brushed something stiff in the breast pocket. He drew it out slow, like a man handling evidence. A card. A little thing the kind of body might buy at a trading post for a penny, wet near to ruin the ink bleeding across it in long blue rivers. But 2 things on it could still be read. In the center, in the big, shaky letters a child makes when a grown hand guides them, 3 words. Daddy's Angels. And down in the corner a name. Hargrove. Parson stood there a long moment in the firelight. Then he turned and crossed the room and held the card out to Reuben without a word. Reuben took it in 2 fingers. He looked at it for the length of time it takes a heart to break and mend and break again. "This is the card," he said. His voice had gone strange. "The one I bought her, for her birthday come spring." He looked up and there was something in his face the men had never seen there. She had it on her. At the doctor's. She wouldn't put it down for anything. The fire popped. The wind groaned against the walls. And Reuben Hargrove, who had not wept in 15 years, sat with his daughter asleep on his chest and a ruined penny card in his hand, and he understood that he had no notion at all what had happened down in that town tonight. No notion how his daughter had come to be 6 miles up a mountain in a blizzard. No notion where she'd been between the doctor's door and his own. No notion who the boy was. But the boy knew, and the boy was going to wake up. He woke a little before dawn. The storm had broken by then. The wind had quit its howling and gone to a low, tired moan, and the first gray light was creeping in around the shutters. Most of the men had bedded down where they could, but Reuben was still in his chair awake, the child asleep beside him now, under a mound of blankets on the cot. And the boy stirred and his eyes came open, and the first thing those eyes did was search the room, looking for her. "Easy," Reuben said. The boy's gaze swung to him, wide, wary. The eyes of a creature that has learned every kindness has a hook in it somewhere. "She's here," Reuben said. He nodded to the cot. "She's safe. You did that." The boy looked, saw the small shape under the blankets, the dark hair, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. And something went out of him all at once, some terrible tension he'd been carrying so long he'd likely forgotten it was even there. His head dropped back against the pillow. "Good," he whispered. "She kept saying we were close. I didn't know if she was right." Sawbones was up and over in a moment checking him, but the boy was past the worst of it, and the surgeon nodded and stepped back to let them talk. "What's your name, son?" Reuben said. "Asa." A long pause. Like the rest of it cost him something. "Asa Brevard." "Asa." Reuben turned the name over. "You walked here? In that?" "Yes, sir." "From town?" "From the doctor's. Yes, sir." The boy's voice was rough as gravel. 6 miles, I reckon. Maybe more. I lost count after a while." "Carrying her?" "She wasn't heavy." Asa said it simple, like it was nothing. Like a starving boy carrying a child up a mountain through the worst storm of the year was the most ordinary thing in the world. "She wasn't heavy at all." Reuben had to look at the fire a moment before he could go on. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me how you came to have her. Start at the start. Take your time." And Asa told it. He'd been sheltering at the doctor's place in town, he said. Up under the eaves where the wind couldn't reach the way he'd learned to do, finding the dry corners of a world that had no room for him. He'd been on the street 3 weeks now. He didn't say it like he wanted pity. He said it like a fact, the way you'd say the date. And tonight in the thick of the storm, a man had come out the doctor's door. A big man, Asa said. "Near as big as you, sir," with a beard and a scar down the side of his face. He'd come out into the snow with a little girl in his arms, and he'd gotten 3 steps and then he'd gone down. Just dropped. Right there on the steps. Like the string holding him up had been cut. Reuben had gone very still. "He was breathing," Asa said. "I checked, but he couldn't get up. He grabbed my arm. He was strong even like that. And he looked at me and he said..." The boy stopped. "What did he say?" Reuben said, very low. Asa looked at him. "He said, take her. Find the high countrymen. He said she knows the way." And then he pushed her into my arms, and he said it again. "Find them the men up the mountain she knows." And then he just... Asa's hands moved. He went out. The doctor came running, and they carried him inside, and a man told me I couldn't stay, that I had to move along, and I tried to follow, but they shut the door, and the little girl... He glanced at the cot. She kept saying it. "Daddy's angels." And she kept pointing up at the mountain, like she knew exactly where to go. The boy shook his head slow, like he still didn't understand it. "So I walked. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't leave her there in the cold. She kept pointing, and I followed a baby up a mountain in a blizzard." A faint, exhausted breath that was almost a laugh. "Because she seemed so sure, and I wasn't sure of anything anymore. So I let her be sure for both of us." The room was silent. Every man awake now and every one of them looking at Reuben Hargrove, because they had all done the arithmetic. A big man, with a scar down the left side of his face, ear to jaw, collapsing at the doctor's door in town that very night with a little girl in his arms. There was only one man in the whole territory that fit. It was him. It was Reuben. He had no memory of it. That was the cold horror of the thing settling over the room. He remembered going down to town feeling poorly, remembered the doctor frowning over him, talking about his heart, telling him to rest to stay the night, remembered Bertie at his side, refusing to be parted from him, clutching her little penny card. And then nothing. A gap, a hole in the night where his own body had failed him and his legs had gone out from under him in the snow. And in that hole, with the last of his strength, some part of him had done the only thing a father could do. He'd given his child to a stranger, a homeless boy he'd never laid eyes on, a boy the rest of the world had thrown away. He'd looked at that boy in the half-second his body had left him, and something in Reuben had known the way you know a thing in your blood, that this one would not let her freeze. And he'd been right. "It was me," Reuben said. The words came out of him slow and heavy as stones drop down a well. Asa blinked. "Sir, the man at the doctor's." Reuben's hand had found Bertie's blanket, without him meaning it, to just resting there, just feeling her breathe. "The one who gave you my daughter. That was me." He looked at the boy. "I don't remember it. My heart, the doctor says my heart isn't sound. I went down and I gave her to you, and I told you to find my brothers." His voice caught. "And you did. You walked 6 miles through hell carrying my child because she pointed up a mountain, and you brought her home to the one place on this earth where she'd be safe." For a long moment, Asa Brevard just stared at him. This boy who'd been turned away from every door for 3 weeks, who'd been told by every grown soul in his life that he was a problem, a burden, a thing to be shuffled along and forgotten. He stared at the giant in the buffalo coat, and his face did something complicated, like a man trying to take in news too big for the size of his life. "I didn't know," Asa said finally. "I didn't know who she was. She needed help, that's all. She needed help and there wasn't anybody else." "I know it," Reuben said. "I'd have done it for anybody's girl." "I know that too." And Reuben Hargrove leaned forward, this mountain of a man, and he put one great scarred hand on the boy's thin shoulder, gentle as he knew how. "And that's the whole of it, son. That's everything. You'd have done it for anybody. That's exactly why she's alive." The boy's eyes filled. He looked away fast, wiped at his face with the back of his good hand, rough, ashamed of it. And not one man in that room let on they'd seen. Daylight came up cold and clean over the valley. The storm had passed. The world outside was white and silent and new. Every ugly thing buried under 3 feet of snow, and inside the ranch house, a fire burned and a child slept, and a homeless boy lay wrapped in wool, finally warm. Reuben stood at the window with Bertie in his arms. She'd woken and would not be held by anyone else, and he found that he could not have parted with her if his life depended on it. She had her small hand fisted in his beard. She was telling him a long and serious story about the angels, most of it, in words that weren't quite words yet, and he was listening to every one of them like scripture. It struck him, standing there, how light she was, how small, and how easy it would have been for the world to lose her in the dark. He thought of the boy, a stranger, a nobody, the town would have said, and he thought of how thin the thread had been, how close his daughter had come to being just a thing that vanished in a storm with no one ever to know. Across the room, Shade came and stood at his shoulder. The two of them watched the boy sleep. "He's been on the street 3 weeks, Shade said quiet. "In this country, in this season." He shook his head. "Most don't last 3 days." "No," Reuben said. "Somebody put him out there." Shade's gray eyes were flat and hard. "A boy that age doesn't end up walking the cold alone for no reason. Somebody let it happen, or made it happen." Reuben said nothing, but his arm tightened the smallest bit around his daughter. "When he's strong enough," Shade went on, "he ought to tell us the whole of it, where he comes from, who put him on the street, what happened to his people." "He will." Reuben looked down at the boy, at the thin chest rising and falling, at the bandaged hand, at the face that in sleep finally looked its age, 15 years old, and no more a child who'd been made to carry a man's load. When he's ready, not before. And then Reuben Hargrove was quiet a long moment. Outside, the sun cleared the ridgeline and came pouring gold across the snow. And then, he said, we'll see who needs answering to. He did not know yet. He could not have known standing there in the clean, cold light with his daughter in his arms and the worst of the night behind him. He did not know that the boy sleeping by his fire had carried more than a child up that mountain. He'd carried something else. Words, numbers, a thing he'd overheard 3 weeks past crouched in the dark and the wet, the kind of thing a body memorizes without understanding because there's nothing else to do with it. He did not know that those words would crack open a grave 15 years deep, that a name was coming, a name Reuben hadn't let himself say aloud in a decade and a half, a name tied to a stolen claim and a lost daughter and a gentle brother who'd vanished into a county ledger and never come out. He only knew what he could see. A storm survived, a child saved, a boy who'd had nothing left to give and had given his coat anyway. And so Reuben Hargrove stood at the window as the sun came up, and he held his daughter, and for the first time in a long, long while, something stirred in the frozen ground of him that he thought was dead and gone for good. It felt almost like hope. He didn't trust it yet, but it was there. And down the mountain in a fine, warm house in Quartz Hollow, a man named Cornelius Hatch slept soundly in his bed with no notion at all that the family he'd signed off their land 3 weeks past had a boy in it. A boy who had just walked through the worst storm of the winter and lived and remembered every word. He told the rest of it 2 days later. By then, the boy could sit up, could keep food down. The color had come back into his face, and the swelling had gone out of his hand, and he'd slept the deep, dreamless sleep a body sleeps when it finally believes the door is locked against the cold. Sawbones said he was mending, said it was a near thing and a miracle, and he didn't use that word loose. And there was a woman there now, too. Her name was Tamsin Rowe, a widow. She kept a little practice down in Quartz Hollow tending the sick and birthing the babies and setting the bones. The town's drunkard of a doctor couldn't be bothered with. 40-some years old with steady hands and tired eyes and a way of moving through a room that made hard men mind their manners. Sawbones had sent word down the mountain for her on account of the boy's hand and Reuben's heart both, and she'd come up through the snow on a borrowed mule without a word of complaint. She'd worked at the county poor farm once, years back as a young woman before it closed its doors. She didn't talk about it much, but she would. Before this was through, she had Asa propped up by the fire with a cup of broth, and she was changing the dressing on his hand gentle when Reuben pulled a chair around and sat. "You up to talking, son?" Asa looked at the cup, then at the fire. Then he nodded. "Start with home," Reuben said. "You had one, once. Cottonwood Bend." The boy said it soft, like the name still hurt to hold. "My pa proved up a claim there. Quarter section good water. We had it 8 years. A pause. He passed 2 winters back. Lung fever. After that, it was just me and my mother. And then they took it." Reuben said nothing. He'd learned these 2 days that the boy told a thing best when you let the silence pull it out of him. 3 weeks ago, Asa said, a man came from the county office, said there was a mistake in our papers. An error, he called it. Said our filing had a flaw in it, and the claim reverted to the government, and we had 30 days that were already most gone. His jaw worked. My mother showed him my pa's patent, the real one, with the seal on it. He looked right at it, and he said it didn't matter. Said the correction had already been entered. Said the land was spoken for. Spoken for by who? A company, the Drummond Land Company. Asa's eyes came up. There's a rail line coming through the bend. Everybody knows it. The water's worth a fortune to whoever holds it when the track lays down, and our quarter section sits right across the easiest grade for 10 miles in any direction. Tamsin's hands had gone still on the bandage. Reuben felt something cold move through him, but he kept his face like stone. Go on, he said. So Asa went on. His mother had taken sick during the eviction, he said. The worry of it, the cold of being put out into the snow with their goods piled in the yard. A cough that went down into her chest and wouldn't let go. They'd carried her to the county, and the county had put her in the sick ward, and they'd told Asa, 15 years old with no claim and no kin near, and no place left on God's earth that was his that he ought to go to the poorhouse. Did you? For 4 days. The boy looked at the fire. Then I left. Why? And Asa was quiet a while. Because in there, he said, you stop being a person. Reuben went very still. You get a number, the boy said. A cot. A line you stand in for your supper. Nobody knows your name and nobody asks it. And after a few days, you start to feel it. You start to feel yourself going. Like if you stayed long enough, you'd just become a name in a book somewhere, a line in a ledger, and one day they'd close the book and you'd be gone, and not a soul on earth would notice. He swallowed. So I left. Figured I'd rather freeze a free thing than disappear a kept one. Figured I'd find work, find a place, get my mother out when she was well again. He gave a small broken laugh. Except nobody hires a boy with no roof, and nobody rents a roof to a boy with no work. So I just, his hand opened, walked, 3 weeks, sleeping where I could, and then a man fell down in the snow and put his daughter in my arms. The fire popped, and Reuben Hargrove sat there with his big hands hanging between his knees, and he understood that he was looking at a thing he knew, not from a story, from the inside, from his own life 15 years gone. The same cold, the same closing book, the same machine that takes a person and turns them into paper and then loses the paper. This man from the county office, Reuben said. Who signed the order on your claim? There'd be a name on it. There was. Asa looked at him. I saw it on the paper, the correction. It was signed by the commissioner himself. A pause. A man named Hatch. Cornelius Hatch. Reuben did not move. He did not move at all. But somewhere deep in him, in the frozen ground he'd thought was dead, something turned over. Slow and cold, and patient, like a thing waking up after a long, long sleep. Say that name again, Reuben said. Hatch. Asa frowned. Commissioner Cornelius Hatch. They say he's a good man, builds the church a new roof, drives the meal wagon out to the old folks at Christmas. The boy shook his head. Everybody likes him. Yeah, Reuben said, flat, far away. I know who he is. Asa looked at him strange. You know him. I knew him 15 years ago, Reuben said, when he weren't a commissioner, when he weren't anything at all. A clerk, a young clerk in the county office, processing corrections, when the railroad first started buying up this country. His voice had gone to something the boy had not heard from him before. Quiet. But the quiet had a floor under it that dropped away into somewhere dark. Keep talking, son. There's more. I can see there's more. What else did you hear? And here was the thing. There was more. Asa hesitated, like he wasn't sure it mattered, like he'd been carrying it so long he'd half forgotten he had it at all. There was a night, he said, maybe 10 days into it. I was sleeping behind the livery stable, back of the county office. There's a gap in the boards where the warm air comes out from the office stove, and I'd found it, and I was sleeping there to keep from freezing to death. He looked at his hands. And 2 men were talking, on the other side of the wall, close as you are to me right now. The commissioner was one of them. I knew his voice by then, and I couldn't sleep for the cold, so I listened. There wasn't anything else to do with myself. What did he say? The boy closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, the words came out in a strange, flat rhythm. The rhythm of a thing said over and over in the dark every night for 3 weeks, memorized without meaning, because there was nothing else in the world to hold on to. He said the Brevard correction goes through this week. That's mine. My family. He said the Drummond men want the bend cleared before the survey crews come. Asa's brow furrowed, pulling the words up one at a time. He said 15 years and nobody's ever once looked twice at a land correction. He said a number, 11,000, in gold, same as the Willow Draw parcel. Reuben's hands had closed into fists. And then, Asa said, then he said the thing I didn't understand, the thing that stuck. He said, the boy opened his eyes. He looked at Reuben. He said the Hargrove file from '69 is closed, and it stays closed. He said there's nothing left in it to find. The room stopped breathing. Shade, who'd been cleaning a rifle in the corner, set it down. Parson, half in shadow by the wall, came forward a step. Sawbones turned from the stove, and Tamsin Rose sat back on her heels and put one hand over her mouth, because Reuben Hargrove had not moved. He sat there in his chair, a mountain of a man gone to stone, and his eyes were fixed on the boy like Asa had just spoken a language out of a grave. The fire threw its light across that scarred face and found nothing moving in it at all. "You're certain," Reuben said. His voice was a whisper now. Those exact words, the Hargrove file, 69. "I'm certain." Asa's own voice had gone small, frightened of what he'd loosed and not understanding it. "I didn't have anything to write with. I just said it over. Every night. The names, the numbers. Brevard, Drummond, Willow Draw, Hargrove 69. He spread his bandaged hand helpless. "I didn't know what any of it meant. I still don't, but you do. Don't you? You know what it means." Reuben Hargrove rose from his chair, slow, the way a mountain might rise if a mountain could. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to the room, and he looked out at the white silence of the valley, and his shoulders were a wall against them all. When he finally spoke, he did not turn around. "In 69, he said, I had a claim of my own, up the North Fork. Good water like yours. I had a wife, her name was Marigold, and she was the best thing that ever happened to a man like me. I had a daughter, Faye, near a year old, and I had my brother Hollis living with us, because Hollis wasn't made for the world the way the rest of us are. He was gentle, soft in his thinking, the doctors would have said. But there wasn't a kinder soul ever drew breath, and he was mine to look after, and I did." The fire crackled. Nobody moved. "There was a rail line coming," Reuben said. "Same as now, and my water sat in the wrong place. Same as yours." His hand against the windowsill had begun to tremble. "And one day a man came from the county office, a young clerk. Said there was an error in my filing. Said the claim reverted. I showed him my patent. He said it didn't matter. The correction had been entered." He stopped. "I fought it. I had no money and no name, but I fought it the only way a man like me knew how: too loud and too long and too late. And while I was fighting for the land, the rest of it slipped right through my fingers. The county said a man with no claim and no work couldn't keep a proper household. They said Faye would be better placed elsewhere with people who could provide for her. And Hollis," his voice cracked clean down the middle. "They said Hollis needed care I couldn't give him. They took him to the county home, a place for folks like him, they said. And then the place closed, and his file was marked transferred, and there was no forwarding given, and I never saw my brother again." Tamsin Rowe made a small sound, like a thing breaking. "Marigold took a fever the winter after," Reuben said, quieter now. "Her heart was already broke clean in two by then. I don't think she had the strength left to fight it. I buried her up the North Fork, and I went up the mountain, and I didn't come down for a long time." He drew a slow breath. "Bertie came later. A second wife gone now, too. God rest her. Sweetest 2 years of my life, and then the fever took her as well and left me that little girl. So you see, son, I know about losing. I've made a study of it." He was quiet a moment. "And I told myself all those years that the questions didn't matter anymore. That Faye was grown and gone wherever they sent her. That Hollis was—" he couldn't say it. "That there was nothing left to find." He turned around, and the men saw their leader's face, and what was in it was not grief. It was older than grief, and colder. "And now a starving boy walks up my mountain in a blizzard," Reuben said, carrying my second daughter. "And he tells me that the same man who closed my file 15 years ago just closed his family's too. The same clerk, grown into a commissioner now, driving his Christmas wagon, roofing his church." A terrible quiet. "Doing the very same thing he's done for 15 years, to family after family after family. Then there's more than us," Asa whispered. "More than your people and mine." "There's a great many more," Reuben said. "I'd stake my life on it." He looked around the room, at Shade, at Sawbones, at Parson, at the boy by the fire and the woman beside him and his daughter asleep in the next room. "Ledger," he said. A younger man stepped from the back of the room. Lean, quick-eyed, not yet 30, with ink stains worked permanent into his fingers. They called him Ledger because he could read a column of figures the way other men read a trail, and he'd clerked for a railroad survey before he'd thrown it over and come up the mountain with his conscience in pieces. Right here. I need every land record you can lay hands to. Corrections, reverts, claims that changed hands these 15 years. Anything with Hatch's name on it. Anything tied to Drummond. Reuben paused. And that county home. The one that closed. I need to know where it stood. Who owned the ground after. And where its people went when they shut the doors. Tamsin spoke up then, soft. It stood on Cedar Hollow. Every head turned to her. I worked there, she said, as a girl, before they closed it in '70. Her hands had folded tight in her lap. And the ground it stood on, Mr. Hargrove's Cedar Hollow, runs right along the river bottom. Flat. Good grade. The kind of ground a railroad would give its eye teeth for. She looked up and her face had gone pale. They didn't close that place to save money. They closed it because somebody wanted the land it sat on, and the people inside it were just in the way. The room went very quiet, because there it was, the shape of the whole thing coming clear at last. It wasn't two crimes, it was one. The same hand reaching for the same prize, 15 years apart. Land the railroad wanted, and anybody on it, a homesteader, a widow, a gentleman who couldn't speak for himself, anybody on it was just an obstacle to be cleared. By a lie if a lie would do it, and by worse if it wouldn't. That's locked up tight in the county office, Ledger said quietly, down in Quartz Hollow. They won't hand any of it over to the likes of us. No, Reuben said. They won't. And something in the way he said it made every man in the room go still. Because they had ridden with Reuben Hargrove a long time, and they knew the difference between a thing he was thinking on and a thing he had decided. This was decided. Shade, Reuben said. Send to Quincy and to the others, the North Fork men, the High Valleys, all of them. Shade's gray eyes sharpened. You're calling the whole of them down. I'm calling all of them. For what? To stand, Reuben said, where folks would rather not see us, outside that county office, at first light day after tomorrow. His jaw set hard. We've spent 15 years being the thing this valley's afraid of. Time we were afraid of somewhere it might do some good. They came in the dark before the dawn. Quincy came first, an old man with a white beard down to his belt, and a brigade behind him. Men who'd trapped these mountains when they were young. And the country was younger free riders who answered to no law but the one in their own chests. Then the North Fork men. Then the High Valley riders in 2s and 3s and 10s coming down out of the snow with their breath ghosting white and their horses stamping until the road into Quartz Hollow filled with the slow thunder of hooves. By the time the sun came up over the ridge, there were 200 of them. 200 riders, 200 horses, lined up across the whole of the open ground before the county office rank on rank, still as a graveyard and twice as quiet. They carried no torches. They shouted no slogans. They simply sat their horses in the cold gray light, 200 scarred and bearded and weathered men, and they waited. And at the center of the front rank on a great gray horse in his buffalo coat, with the scar pale on his face and his eyes fixed on the office door, sat Reuben Hargrove. The town woke to it slow. A shopkeeper opened his door saw and shut it again. A woman crossing to the well stopped dead in the road. The office clerk, a timid, narrow fellow named Wendell, came up the steps to open the place for the day, and he saw 200 riders staring at him out of the dawn. And he dropped his keys in the snow and could not for a long moment make his hands work to pick them up. Nobody broke a law. That was the thing of it. They didn't lift a hand. They didn't say a word. They just sat there 200 strong being seen. And there is a kind of power in being seen when you are the thing folks have spent years pretending not to look at. A man came hurrying up the street with a tin star on his coat. Sheriff Dolan. A heavy-set fellow, soft in the middle with small, quick eyes that had spent a whole career learning which way the wind blew and leaning into it. He took one look at the wall of riders and his hand went to his gun, and then wisely it came away again. Hargrove, he called out. His voice cracked on it. What in tarnation is this? Reuben looked down at him from the gray horse. A peaceable morning, Sheriff, and he said, We're not breaking anything. We're not touching anything. We're just here. Here for what? To see a wrong looked at, that's all. Reuben's voice carried in the still air, calm and deep and certain. There's families in this territory been put off their land by paper that's a lie. And there's folks gone missing out of a county home that nobody ever once went looking for. We mean to see it answered, and we mean to be standing right here while it is. Dolan's eyes flicked to the office, to a second-floor window where a curtain had twitched, and Reuben saw it. He saw the sheriff's eyes go up to that window like a dog checking with its master. He saw the small flinch of a man who's been told what to do and is just now reckoning the size of what he's been told to do it to. So now he knew that too. He knew exactly where the sheriff's loyalty lay. You can't just sit here, Dolan tried. There's no law against sitting, Sheriff, Reuben said. You're welcome to go through your books and find one. We'll wait. And they did. The sun climbed. The town stirred and shrank and stirred again. A newspaper man came down from the county seat on a hard-ridden horse drawn by word that was already spreading like fire through dry grass, and he set up to capture the sight of it, 200 riders silent in the snow, and the whole respectable face of Quartz Hollow hiding behind its curtains. Reuben gave the man 3 sentences and nothing more. There were families robbed of their land by false papers. There were people vanished from a county home with no one to answer for them. And they would be standing right here until somebody inside that building did right. By mid-morning, the word had reached the county seat. By noon, it had gone further. Because some stories travel on horseback, but a story like this one, the devils of Dry Fork standing guard for the poor against a beloved commissioner, a story like that in this country, in this season, ran ahead of any horse alive. And inside the county office, behind the twitching curtain on the second floor, Cornelius Hatch stood at his window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he watched 200 men he could not buy and could not frighten sit their horses in the snow. And for the first time in 15 years, the patient, smiling church roofing commissioner felt the cold finger of fear lay itself along his spine. He set down the coffee. He'd built a wall 15 years high, brick by careful brick. Every paper filed clean. Every clerk who asked too many questions eased out the door with a good reference and a quiet warning. Every family scattered too far and too poor to ever come together and point at him. He'd been so careful. He'd been so very careful. And it had never once occurred to him, not in all those years, to be afraid of a homeless boy. Reuben sat the long morning out, and somewhere in the middle of it, near the hour, when his back ached and his old wound throbbed in the cold, a thought came to him. A simple one. It came watching the sheriff confer with a deputy, watching the curtain twitch, watching the whole slow machinery of the town start to grind itself towards some answer. The thought was this. Asa had stood here too once. Not on a horse, not with 200 men at his back. Just a boy alone going door to door, asking for work, asking for a roof, asking the same machine to see him as a person. And it had not. It had looked right through him. It had handed him a number and a cot and a place in line. And the only difference between that boy and Reuben Hargrove was that Reuben had 200 riders. That was all. That was the whole of it. He had men. He had horses. He had a presence the town could not ignore. And a boy alone had none of those things, so the boy had been left to near freeze in the snow, and a commissioner had stolen his land, and a county had lost his family in a book. It was not justice that decided who got seen. It was power. And Reuben Hargrove, sitting his gray horse in the cold, made himself a promise he had not made in 15 years, that so long as he had breath and men and horses, he would spend them standing in front of the ones who had none. The boys turned out into the snow, the brothers lost in ledgers. The gentle souls the county decided were easier gone than kept. He would be the power that saw them. It was past noon when the law moved, but it did not move the way Reuben expected. A deputy came out of the office and crossed to Sheriff Dolan and spoke low in his ear. And Reuben watched the sheriff's face change, watched something firm up in it. A decision made for him from behind a curtain and now to be carried out. Dolan squared his shoulders. He walked to the front of the riders, and he did not look at Reuben. "I've got a warrant," the sheriff called out, and his voice was louder now, sure the voice of a man with paper at his back. "Sworn out, lawful and proper." He pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up. "For a boy, name of Asa Brevard, 15 years of age, last seen in the company of this gathering." A murmur ran down the ranks of riders. Reuben went cold and still. "What's the charge?" he said. And Dolan looked up at him then, and there was something almost like an apology in his small eyes. And under the apology, fear. Because he knew what he was doing, and he knew who he was doing it for. "Child stealing," the sheriff said, "and vagrancy. The boy took a little girl off the streets of this town 3 nights past. Carried her off into the dark. There's witnesses saw it." He swallowed. "The commissioner's office swore the complaint. The boy's a vagrant and a kidnapper, and I'm to bring him in." The silence after that was a terrible thing. Because Reuben understood all at once exactly what was happening. He understood it the way you understand a trap the very instant before it closes. Hatch could not silence 200 riders. But he didn't need to. He only needed to silence one boy. Because Asa Brevard was the only living soul who had heard those words behind the livery wall. Asa was the witness. The one mouth that could say the Hargrove file and Drummond and 11,000 in gold and tie it all to a single name. Discredit the boy, brand him a thief, a kidnapper, a vagrant child, not to be believed. And every word he spoke turned to smoke. Lock him in a cell away from the brothers alone with the machine again, and who knew what might happen to a friendless boy in the dark? The land fraud was a thing of paper and paper could be fought, but a boy was flesh, and Cornelius Hatch had just reached out from behind a curtain with the long, clean arm of the law to take that boy's flesh into his keeping. Reuben Hargrove looked down at the sheriff holding up his lawful paper, and behind him, 200 riders went very, very quiet. Reuben Hargrove did not reach for a gun. That was the thing 200 riders were waiting to see. That was the thing Sheriff Dolan was braced against his soft hand, hovering near his own iron, his small eyes darting. One word from the man on the gray horse, and the snow would run red. Everybody there knew it. Everybody there could feel it, sitting in the air like the moment before lightning. But Reuben did not reach for a gun. He climbed down off the horse instead. Slow, careful of his bad heart. 240 pounds of buffalo coat and gray beard coming down into the snow to stand on his own 2 feet in front of the law. And the sheriff took a step back without meaning to, because a mounted man you can measure, but a man on the ground, that close, that big, that's a different kind of arithmetic. "Let me see the paper," Reuben said. "It's lawful." "I didn't say it wasn't. I said let me see it." Dolan handed it over. His hand shook doing it. Reuben read it slow. He was not a fast reader. He taught himself his letters by lamplight in a trapper's cabin, and he made no apology for the time it took. The riders waited. The town waited. The newspaper man scratched at his pad, and up in the second-floor window, the curtain hung dead still now, because the man behind it had stopped pretending he wasn't watching. "Sworn by the commissioner's office," Reuben said. "Yes. Child stealing. Off a boy who carried a freezing child 6 miles up a mountain to keep her alive." Reuben looked up. "You know whose child, Sheriff?" Dolan said nothing. "Mine," Reuben said. "It was my daughter. The boy you've come to brand a kidnapper saved my daughter's life. And the man who swore this paper knows it. Because the man who swore this paper is the only one in this whole territory with a reason to want that boy's mouth shut." The sheriff's face had gone the color of tallow. "I just served the warrant," he said. "I don't make 'em. You just carry the cold," Reuben said quietly, "for the man who makes it." And here is where it might have gone wrong. Because the riders had heard enough. A growl was building down the ranks low, the sound a thing makes before it moves, and hands were settling on rifles. And the sheriff heard it too, and his nerve was going, and there are moments in this world that tip one way or the other on a hair. And this was one of them. So Reuben turned his back on the sheriff. He turned to face 200 of his own. "No," he said, "just that, to all of them." And the growl died. "Not like this. Not today. We don't give him that." Reuben's voice rolled out over the cold. "He wants us to be devils. He wants blood in this snow so the papers tomorrow read outlaws gun down sheriff instead of commissioner steals from the poor. That's the whole game. Don't you play it for him." He looked at the warrant in his hand. Then he folded it slow and held it out and let it drop into the snow. "The boy's not going anywhere," Reuben said to the sheriff. "Not into a cell, not alone. You want him, you'll do it through the territorial court with a judge in the open in the daylight where folks can see. That's the law too, Sheriff, the part the commissioner forgot to send down with you." And then a voice spoke up that nobody had been waiting for. A woman's voice, clear and cold and caring. "He's quite right, Sheriff." She came up the street on foot, slight, plain-dressed, with a traveling case in one gloved hand and a face that gave away nothing at all. A stranger. The riders parted for her without quite knowing why the way folks part for someone who walks like they've got somewhere to be and the standing to get there. "My name is Marion Sloan," she said. "I am an operative of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, and I have been investigating this county office for 8 months." The street went silent. Dolan stared. You're a detective, yes." Her tone did not invite him to dwell on it. "Hired by a Chicago concern that lost a great deal of money buying land titles out of this office that turned out to be worthless. Stolen, in plain words. I've been building a case against Commissioner Hatch since the spring." She turned her gray eyes up to Reuben, and something in them was almost respect. "Building it slow, careful, brick by brick, the way you build a thing that has to hold up in front of a judge." A pause. "And in 3 days, Mr. Hargrove, you've shaken loose more than I managed in 3 seasons. I would very much like to know what that boy heard." Reuben looked at her a long moment. 8 months, he thought. 8 months she'd been at it with all her training and her agency and her funds, and she'd gotten nowhere a court would call somewhere, and a starving boy had cracked it open in a night because the detective had been looking for paper, and the boy had heard a voice. "You've been building careful," Reuben said. "I have. For 8 months. For 8 months. "We got a boy off the street in 3 days," Reuben said, "and a wall 15 years high started coming down the same night." Detective Sloan held his gaze, and she did not argue, because she knew he was right. "Then perhaps," she said, "we ought to work together. Your reach, my methods, before the commissioner finds a way to make all of this disappear the way he's made so much disappear before." She glanced at the warrant lying in the snow. "And as for that, leave it to me. A federal man comes up from the territorial capital on tomorrow's coach. I wired him a week ago. A warrant sworn by the very office under investigation against the only witness against it will not survive him an hour. The boy is safer than the men who signed that paper. You have my word on it." Reuben put out his hand, and the Pinkerton woman shook it. A scarred trapper's paw swallowing a small gloved hand there in the snow in front of 200 riders and a terrified sheriff and a scribbling newspaper man. It made the front page of the county paper. It made the front page of 3 more after that. And the wall began to fall. The federal man came up on the coach as promised, a square, unsmiling fellow with a satchel full of authority and no patience at all for territorial mischief. He read the warrant. He read the complaint. He listened to 10 minutes of Sheriff Dolan's stammering. And then he tore the warrant clean in half and told the sheriff that the boy Asa Brevard was now a protected witness in a federal land matter, and that any man who laid a hand on him would answer to Washington for it. Dolan went the color of old ash, and his troubles were only starting. The wall fell the way these things fall, not all at once, in pieces, a clerk here, a ledger there. Once the first crack ran through it, the rest came faster than anyone but Reuben Hargrove had dreamed. Detective Sloan had the methods. She had subpoenas in the ear of the federal land agent and the patience to chase a single dollar of stolen gold through 3 banks and 2 false names. But what she'd never had was witnesses. The families were scattered. The clerks were frightened. The whole machine had been built so that no one mouth could ever say enough to matter. The riders changed that, because the riders could go to doors that would never open for a Pinkerton. Parson found the first one. An old woman named Eulalia Mott, 71 years old, who'd taught the children of Quartz Hollow their letters for 40 years before her eyes gave out. She'd taught Asa's mother, once a sweet girl with a gift for sums, and she'd watched 3 weeks pass from her window as a thin boy sat on the steps of his emptied house and did not know where in the world to go. "I knew that boy was in trouble," she told Parson, her old hands twisting in her lap. "I sent word to the county. Twice, nobody answered. Nobody came." Her voice broke. "I told myself someone else would see to it. I told myself it weren't my place." She looked up and her old eyes were wet. "And then I heard he'd been on the street 3 weeks. 3 weeks in this cold, while I sat warm by my own fire telling myself it weren't my place." "It's not too late to make it your place," Parsons said gentle. "What you saw, ma'am, that's not just a sorrow. That's a witness. And Eulalia Mott wiped her eyes and squared her thin shoulders and said she'd swear to every word of it before any judge alive. Then came the second. A man named Clement Dorsey, 56 years old. He'd clerked in the county office for years under Hatch, handling whatever paper Hatch put in front of him, land and poor relief and the business of the county home, all crossing the same desk. He'd resigned of a sudden one autumn for reasons he'd never given. Detective Sloan found him on a hardscrabble farm 2 valleys over, and when she said the name Hatch, the man went gray, and when she said there'd be a trial, he sat down hard on his own porch step and put his face in his hands. "I knew," he said. "God help me, I knew. He'd bring me a file, tell me there was an error wanted correcting, move the claim sign here, and I'd ask why, and he'd say it was procedure eligibility, this and that, and the first few times I believed him." He shuddered. "Then I saw the pattern of it. Always the parcels the railroad wanted. Always right before the company bought in. Always a family put out into the cold." "Why did you leave?" Sloan asked. "He brought me a file one day," Clement said. "A widow, 2 little ones, dying of a wasting sickness and waiting on a claim that was rightly hers. He told me to sign the revert, and I looked at that file and I thought of my own mother and I said no." He stared at the ground. "He gave me a week to think on it, told me my position was under review, told me there were lean times coming and I'd want to be seen as a man who cooperated." A bitter breath. "So I resigned. Personal reasons, I told everybody. The personal reason was I couldn't look in the glass of a morning." Detective Sloan wrote it all down. But there was one more thing, and the one more thing did not come out until the trial itself. It was a cold, bright morning when they brought Cornelius Hatch before the territorial court. The whole town came. They could not help themselves. The respectable folk who'd hidden behind their curtains, the shopkeepers, the church ladies who'd praised his generosity from their pews, they all came to see the beloved commissioner sit at the defendant's table in a courtroom packed to the rafters. And the riders came. They filled the back of the room and lined the walls outside, 200 strong, silent, watching. And at the front, just behind the rail, sat Reuben Hargrove with little Bertie on his knee, and Asa Brevard beside him, and Tamsin Rowe beside the boy. And it looked for all the world like a family, because by now it very nearly was. The evidence came in like a tide. Detective Sloan laid out the gold. Every payment from the Drummond Land Company, traced through its false names, matched against the date of every stolen claim. Clement Dorsey took the stand and named the pattern. Eulalia Mott told of the boy on the steps and the word she'd sent that no one answered. The ledgers were read into the record, and the federal land agent testified to the survey maps and parcel by parcel, family by family. The smiling face the town had loved for 15 years was peeled away to show the thing beneath. 41 families put off their land by a lie, and then the matter of the county home. Because Detective Sloan had pulled that thread too, the one Reuben had set her to, and what she'd found had turned even her cold professional stomach. Cedar Hollow, a county home for the indigent and the infirm. Closed in '70 when the railroad wanted the river bottom it sat on. And its people, the old, the sick, the ones soft in their thinking, the ones with no kin to come asking, its people marked, transferred, and scattered to the winds with no forwarding given. 19 of them from the wing they'd called House 7. Of those 19, the record showed that no one had ever once gone to check on 16. The other 16 had simply stopped being people. They'd become a line in a closed book. And one of those 16 was named Hollis Hargrove. Reuben sat very still through all of it with his daughter on his knee. He did not weep. He had done his weeping in private in the dark over 15 long years. But Tamsin Rowe beside him. Tamsin, who had walked the halls of that very poor farm, as a young woman who had carried her own silence about it all this time. Tamsin reached over and put her hand on the boy Asa's shoulder, and she did not take it away. It was on the second day that it broke open. Clement Dorsey was back on the stand. Detective Sloan was walking him through the closure of Cedar Hollow, the transfer orders, the signatures. And she set a document before him, an old one yellowed, and asked him to read the name signed at the bottom. And Clement Dorsey looked at the paper, and the color went out of his face entire. "Mr. Dorsey," the judge said, "the witness will read the signature." But Clement Dorsey did not read it. He turned in the witness chair, turned all the way around past the lawyers, past the judge, until he was looking at one man in that crowded room. He looked at Reuben Hargrove. "It's mine," he said. The courtroom did not understand, but Reuben did. Reuben felt it coming the way you feel the floor go out from under you. The signature, Clement said, and his voice was shaking to pieces now. On the transfer. House 7, 70. It's mine, I signed it. Hatch put it in front of me with 30 others, and he said it was routine, said it was just moving folks along to better care, and I signed them. All of them, without ever reading the names. He was weeping openly now, an old man coming apart in front of the whole town. I signed your brother away, Mr. Hargrove, with my own hand. I never knew his name. I never knew he was yours. I never knew he was anybody's at all. That was the whole sin of it. I let him be nobody so I wouldn't have to look. The room erupted. The judge hammered for order. The lawyers shot to their feet. And in the back, 200 riders went rigid, and every eye in that courtroom swung to Reuben Hargrove. Because they all knew what kind of man they thought he was. The devil of Dry Fork, the man the valley feared. And here was the soul who'd signed away his gentle brother, weeping 10 feet from him, defenseless as a child. Reuben rose. The room went silent so fast it was like a door slamming. The judge's gavel stopped in the air. Asa half came up out of his seat. Tamsin's hand tightened white on the rail. Reuben Hargrove crossed the open floor of the courtroom. Slow. 240 pounds of him, every footstep, a drumbeat in the dead quiet. He walked to the witness stand, and he stood over the weeping old man, this mountain of grief and muscle close enough to break him in half with one hand. And Clement Dorsey did not flinch. He lifted his ruined face and looked up at the man whose brother he'd lost. And he said, "Do what you've a right to." For a long, long moment, Reuben said nothing. 15 years he'd carried this. 15 years he'd wondered who. 15 years he'd built a wall of his own around his heart, made himself hard, made himself cold, made himself a thing that did not hope, because hoping cost too much. And here was the hand that had done it, right here, weeping and within his reach. And every hard year in him wanted to close that hand into a fist. But he thought of his brother. He thought of Hollis, gentle Hollis who'd never raised a hand to a living soul, who'd cry if he stepped on a beetle, who'd loved everything the world couldn't find a use for. And he knew the way you know a thing in your blood, exactly what his brother would want done with the broken old man in that chair. And he thought of Asa, watching. A boy who'd been thrown away, learning right now in this room what a man does with his power when he finally gets some. Reuben reached out. The whole room flinched, and he laid his great scarred hand on Clement Dorsey's shoulder. Gentle, the very same way he'd laid it on Asa's that first cold night. "You let him be nobody," Reuben said low, "so you wouldn't have to look." "Yes." "Then look at me now." Reuben's voice broke just at the edge of it. "Look at his brother, and carry his name out of here. Hollis Hargrove. He was somebody, he was mine. And you're going to say it to every soul who will listen the rest of your days so it never happens to another one." His hand tightened the smallest bit. "That's what I've a right to, not your blood, your remembering. You give me that and we're square." Clement Dorsey wept like the breaking of a dam. And in the back of that courtroom, 200 hard men stood with their hats in their hands and their own eyes wet because they had ridden behind this man for years, thinking they knew the size of him. And they had not. Not by half. Cornelius Hatch was convicted on every count. 41 counts of fraud. The theft of the county home and the scattering of its people. Conspiracy with the Drummond men whose own reckoning was just beginning. The judge, a hard old territorial man who'd seen the country at its worst, gave him the longest sentence the law allowed. Life. The whole of it. In the territorial prison with no road back. Every dollar he'd stolen ordered restored. Every false correction struck from the books, and every family that could be found, and their land returned to them. He did not rage when they read it. He did not weep. He'd built his whole life out of being careful, and even now he was careful, his face a smooth mask as they let him out in chains. But as he passed the rail, he looked once at the boy, at Asa Brevard, the vagrant, the nobody, the one mouth he'd reached out to silence and could not. And the boy looked back at him steady and did not look away. That was all. That was the whole of their reckoning. A look. And then the man who'd thought he could make people disappear was gone through the door into the cold, into the dark of a cell he would not leave, and the long, clean arm of the law that he'd used to such cruel purpose closed at last around him instead. As for Sheriff Dolan, he was not a brave man, and he was not a good one, but at the end he was a frightened one, and frightened men talk. He told the federal agent everything he knew in exchange for his own skin, which was less than he'd hoped and more than he deserved. He turned in his star and left the territory on a westbound coach, and Quartz Hollow swore in a new sheriff who'd ridden as it happened with the North Fork men in his younger days. Outside the courthouse, 200 riders started for their horses, and the snow that fell that afternoon fell soft, soft and clean and new. Asa went home to family. Not the poorhouse, not the street. His mother mended slow through the spring, and an aunt came down from a far county to keep the house and the land at Cottonwood Bend was given back with the commissioner's own stolen gold to make the thing right. There was a roof, there was a fire, there was a bed that did not sag, and meals where nobody counted the minutes. But it was the riders who came in the months after who made it a life. Parson came and sat on the porch and talked to the boy about the things that wake a body in the dark, because Parson knew those things. Sawbones came and checked the hand that had so nearly died and pronounced it whole. Ledger came and taught the boy his figures and his letters and how to read a land patent so that no man could ever lie to him about one again so long as he lived. And Reuben came. He'd ride down from the mountain of an evening, the great gray horse in the buffalo coat, and the neighbors who'd once crossed the street learned to lift a hand to him instead. He'd sit with the boy on the porch, and they'd watch the light go gold on the hills, and they wouldn't say much because neither of them was built for much saying. But one evening Asa asked him the thing. "Why'd you trust me?" the boy said. "That night, you gave me your daughter, and you didn't even know my name." And Reuben was quiet a while. "I didn't trust you," he said. "I was past trusting anybody. I'd had it beat clean out of me." He looked out at the hills. "But there's a thing happens, son, when a man's at the very end of himself. The lying part falls away, and all that's left is what you truly are underneath." He turned and looked at the boy. "I looked at you in that half a second I had, a boy with nothing, cold and starving and thrown away by the whole world. And some part of me that was past lying knew you'd keep her warm." A long pause. "Because the world had handed you every reason to go cold, and you hadn't. That's the rarest thing there is. Folks given every reason to turn hard who choose to stay tender anyhow." The boy didn't answer, but he sat a little straighter. And something the cold had taken out of him that evening began coming back. There was a wedding in time, a quiet one. Reuben Hargrove and Tamsin Rowe in the little church whose roof a thief had paid for, with a preacher who'd given up his collar standing witness, and a Pinkerton detective come all the way from Chicago, and 200 riders filling the pews and the yard and the road beyond. Bertie carried the flowers and dropped most of them along the way. Asa stood up beside Reuben, as near to a son as made no difference at all. It was a gentle thing, a hand taken, a look held across a quiet room. The kind of love that comes late to people who'd long since stopped expecting it and is worth all the more for the waiting. But the story does not end there, because not a week after the wedding, a telegram came up the mountain. It came from a mission house far to the west, near the coast, run by a woman who'd given her whole life to gathering up the lost ones the world had let fall through its cracks. A Sister Agnes. She'd seen the story in a newspaper that had traveled a long way west, the story of the trial in the county home and the 16 souls who'd vanished. And she'd gone through her own rolls and her own records and the names of all the people in her care. And one of them was a gentleman, soft in his thinking, kind past the telling of it. He'd come to the mission years back from a place that had closed its doors, his papers lost somewhere along the way so that no one ever knew quite where he'd started from. He didn't remember much, but there was one thing he said near every single day to anyone who would listen. He had a brother, a big brother who'd looked after him once, who would come and find him someday. He was sure of it. He had never once stopped being sure of it. His name was Hollis. Reuben read the telegram standing on his own porch in the gold light of evening, with his new wife at his side and his daughter at his knee, and the boy he'd come to raise as a son just coming up the steps. He read it once, then he read it again, and the great scarred hands that held it began to shake, and the mountain of a man sank down onto the step and could not for a long moment make a single sound at all. 15 years he told himself there was nothing left to find, and his brother had never once stopped being sure he'd come. He went west on the very next train. And there was a reunion on a sun-warm porch by the sea that the words of this telling are far too small to hold. A gentleman and his big brother, 15 years of lost time between them. And the first thing Hollis said when he saw the scarred giant coming up the path was not a question and not a cry. He just smiled the way he'd always smiled, and he said, "I knew you'd come. I told them. I told everyone you would." And Reuben Hargrove gathered his brother up into his arms. This man the world had decided was nobody, and he held on, and he did not let go for a long, long time. He brought Hollis home to the mountain, and the two of them with Tamsin and Bertie and the boy down the valley made the closest thing to whole that a broken family ever gets to make. Faye was not found. Not that year. Reuben's first daughter, lost to the same cruelty all those years gone, was out there somewhere, still a grown woman now. And the detective kept the file open, and the writers kept their ears to the ground, and the searching went on. But it went on with hope in it now. Because the frozen ground in Reuben Hargrove, the ground that had cracked the first night a half-frozen boy fell through his door and thawed by slow inches through all the long months after that ground had come all the way to spring at last. And a man who has felt his own heart thaw does not easily give up on anybody being found. He had learned the lesson the boy carried up the mountain in the storm. The lesson written on a ruined penny card in a child's hand. That no soul is ever truly nobody. That the world will hand a person a number and a cot and a closed book, and the world will be wrong. And that sometimes, not always, but sometimes the story does not end the way you've spent 15 years bracing for. Sometimes it ends better. The card still hangs in the house at Dry Fork. Framed now, the ink long since bled to pale blue ghosts, but you can read it still if you know what it says. Daddy's Angels. And little Birdie, grown bigger now, will tell you if you ask her that it's true. That angels are real. That they came for her in the worst storm of the winter when she was small and the whole world had gone cold. They just didn't look the way the storybooks say. They had scars and gray beards and coats made out of buffalo hide. They were the men the whole valley had been taught to fear. And they were the only ones in all that cold, wide country who opened the door. And the boy who carried her. The boy who'd been thrown away. The boy with every reason in the world to go cold who chose to stay warm. He grew up to spend his whole life opening doors for others. Because somebody once on the worst night of his life had opened one for him.